Hello everyone, this is part 2 of my video on Pan's Labyrinth representation. This is for component 2, section A, global film of the Eduqas A-level film studies exam. This video is going to be focusing on the representation of gender and also the representation of fascists versus the rebels, but also the rich and powerful characters versus the representation of the poor and less powerful characters.
Being that boy's like sucking out a lemon, and I judge myself by the adverts I see. Feel like being a girl, being a girl.
So if characters that conform to traditional representations of gender aren't being represented in a positive light, does that mean that the characters who don't conform to traditional representations of gender are represented in a positive light? And the answer is a big fat yes. So to begin with, we have Ophelia, and Ophelia is not interested in being your traditional girly girl. So unlike her mother, who completely obeys and submits to a man's will, Ophelia is shown to be a disobedient person from the get-go.
Un momento, tu hermano no se encuentra muy bien.
Señora, ¿se encuentra bien?
El portal solo se abrirá si derramamos en él sangre inocente. Solo un poco de sangre. Un pinchazo tan solo. Es la última prueba. Vamos. Prometisteis obedecerme sin chistar. Entregadme al niño.
No. Mi hermano se queda conmigo.
¿Sacrificaréis vuestro derecho sagrado por este mocoso al que apenas conocéis?
Sí, lo sacrifico.
Habéis derramado vuestra sangre antes que la de un inocente. Esa era la última prueba, la más importante.
And normally, when we think of disobedience, we wouldn't necessarily consider that to be a positive trait. It's not like you would compliment a parent by saying, oh yes, your child is very disobedient, it's great. However, in Pan's Labyrinth, disobedience is shown to be a necessary thing. In fact, Dr. Ferrero in the film says at one point to Captain Vidal,
obedecer por obedecer, así sin pensarlo. Eso solo lo hacen gentes como usted, capitán.
She's a very active character, so she isn't afraid to get dirty, to get muddy. She goes on these tasks, even though they're incredibly scary. She shows a great deal of bravery when she interacts with the fawn.
¿Sois vos? ¿Sois vos? Habéis regresado. No os asustéis, os lo ruego. Mirad, mirad.
Mi nombre es Ophelia.
When she interacts with the toad.
Hola, soy la princesa Moana y no te tengo miedo.
And also, of course, the Power Man. And she stands up for what she believes in. So at the end of the film, when the fawn says you have a choice, you can become a princess if you spill the blood of the innocent, she does not do it. She would rather give her own life than to harm another person, and that's because she has a strong moral core. And unlike Ophelia's mother, who is seems to be obsessed with looking pretty and dressing up nicely for Captain Vidal, not that I think Vidal would appreciate it whatsoever, Ophelia doesn't have an interest in those things. And we see this really clearly in the first task, where she has a choice between going to the banquet and wearing this nice pretty dress, or by going on the first task. And so we see there's the close-up on her shoes, which are completely covered in mud, and then she takes off the dress and the camera stays on the dress, and we see that dress blow off in the wind and it gets covered in mud and it all gets ripped up. And this is a really clear sign that Ophelia is rejecting the patriarchy's notion of what a female should look like and how a female should behave. One of the most interesting aspects of the representation of Ophelia is the idea that she is a fairy tale princess, and we hear this very early in the film. The voiceover at the introduction says a princess escaped from this magical land, and obviously that's supposed to be Ophelia. But also the faun calls her Princess Moana, and Ophelia refers to herself as Princess Moana when she first comes across the toad. And when we think about the way that fairy tale princesses are normally represented, they're often very passive characters and the ones who need to be saved by their Prince Charming. And one of the fairy tales that immediately springs to mind when we think of Pan's Labyrinth is The Princess and the Frog. So in that traditional story, it goes that the princess kisses the frog, he turns into a handsome Prince Charming, and then they get married. And this is the way that fairy tales often end. It's with the princess getting married, and for them that's where their story finishes. They've achieved everything that could possibly be achieved by a woman. They've managed to find a rich and handsome man, and then they're married, and then that's the end of their story. But this couldn't be further from the truth for Ophelia. She isn't interested in finding a Prince Charming. In fact, when she comes across the toad does kiss her, and Ophelia is visibly disgusted. We see it in her face. We also have that horrible sound effect of like the squelching of the saliva, and he does that hideous belch as well immediately afterwards. So this kiss is obviously something that Ophelia doesn't desire. However, compared to the Princess and the Frog fairy tale, how it usually goes, he doesn't turn into a Prince Charming. In fact, when he kisses Ophelia, Ophelia ends up killing the toad. So that's as clear as an example as any that Ophelia is rejecting the traditional notions of what a female fairy tale princess should be. And it may be an obvious thing to point out, but Ophelia is the protagonist of the film. She's the main character. So just by putting her as the main character in the film is sending out a clear message regarding the representation of women. They do matter. Their voice, their actions are important, and they can affect change. Even a little girl can affect change. But Ophelia does still exhibit some traditional feminine qualities, things that we would typically see women being represented as. So to begin with, she is a creative, sensitive person, and she does believe in fairies and fairy tales. And this is something that somebody like Vidal would see as being completely irrational and silly and useless. People like Ophelia's mum, who is conforming more to the traditional idea of what a woman should be, also poo-poos Ophelia's interest in these types of things.
Cuentos de hadas. Ya eres muy mayor para llenarte la cabeza con tantas zarandajas.
Interestingly, when she first meets Captain Vidal, Ophelia extends her left hand to him to shake. And quite often, people who are left-handed are often considered to be more artistic, more creative, more sensitive. So this is a clear sign that Ophelia is a creative, sensitive soul, if we didn't already know from the prop of the fairy tale book. And she's also a very compassionate and caring character. She does show affection and love towards her mother, but also to characters like Mercedes and to her young brother as well. So she's happy to be compassionate and caring. She's happy to be imaginative and creative, but she isn't happy to be submissive and to blindly obey male orders. She isn't happy to dress up in pretty dresses. She isn't happy to kiss toads and look for a fairy tale Prince Charming. She wants to make her own story happen. And the other female character that really challenges these traditional representations of femininity is Mercedes. And I think you could argue that Mercedes is the strongest female character in the film and quite a complex representation of a female character. When we're first introduced to Mercedes, she's very often lurking in the background of the shot, and she is being ordered to do things by male characters. And this is a very clear indicator that whilst we find out later on this whole time she is a disobedient character in the same way that Ophelia is, because she's helping out the rebels, she has to do it in the shadows. She has to do it in a way that men like Vidal and the patriarchal structure will not notice. And it's because of her gender that she is underestimated by the men in the film. They don't realise the power that a character like Mercedes has. And this is something that she challenges Vidal about when he eventually does find out that she has been disobeying, that she has been rebelling.
Por el amor de Dios, no es más que una mujer.
Eso es lo que pensó usted siempre. Por eso pude estar cerca. Porque yo era invisible para usted.
Joder,
And so this scene, I think, might be one of the best ones to look at in terms of the representation of both Vidal and Mercedes. So in this scene, we see that sadistic aspect of Vidal's character and the fact that his aggression, his love of violence is being represented as a negative thing. But also we see this representation of Mercedes as a strong and empowered female. At several points during this scene, we get close-ups on the ropes that are tied around Mercedes' wrists. And these are a very powerful symbol. They're a symbol of how women during the Franco-patriarchal regime, how they were restricted, how they were tied in bondage to stop them from being free citizens.
Day after day, there are girls at the office, and men will always be men. Don't send him off with your hair still in curlers. You may not see him again. For wives should always be lovers too.
It also alludes to the classic narrative trope of the damsel in distress who is tied by ropes to the railway line and they have to wait for a male character to come along and save them. However, in the case of Mercedes, because she's a strong and empowered female, she doesn't wait for a man to save her, she saves herself. And the way that she does this, and I think this is really interesting, is the film quite often will show you shots of Mercedes tucking a knife into her apron. And an apron is a costume item that would be traditionally associated with domestic chores, and therefore stereotypically it's something that we would imagine a female character to wear because they'll often be the ones doing the domestic chores. And that's certainly the case in Pan's Labyrinth, and certainly the case in the time that the film is set. But what I like about this is that we see the knife being concealed in this female item of clothing. And this ties in nicely to Carol Clover's book, Men, Women and Chainsaws, where she describes a character called the Final Girl. Now, the Final Girl is a character that you will often see in slasher stalker horror films, films like Halloween or Scream, okay? And I know Pan's Labyrinth isn't a slasher stalker film, but I think that Mercedes, and also Ophelia, because we see her with a knife as well, might be good examples of the Final Girl being transported into this narrative. So what makes Mercedes and Ophelia these Final Girl type characters? Well, it's done through the use of props. So Carol Clover points out that quite often in horror films, slasher stalker films, women are masculinized by phallic appropriation, by picking up a knife, and thereby this masculinizes them because the knife, the prop, is a phallic object. And so when Mercedes is concealing the knife and then producing it from the apron, what she's doing is she is hiding this masculinized aspect of herself inside the disguise of this feminine costume item. And she uses this phallic object, the knife, to free herself from the ropes. We see her cut herself from it, but also she uses it to penetrate Vidal, thereby feminizing him or castrating him, as Carol Clover would say in her essay. And one of the most gruesome aspects of this scene is where Mercedes inserts the knife into Vidal's mouth, and we hear that very sort of gut-churning sound of his mouth being cut open by the knife, thereby giving him this almost sort of yonic symbol on his face. But it's not just the knives and the phallic symbols and the yonic objects which make Mercedes look like an empowered female character in this scene. It's also done through the use of camera work. So up until this point, Mercedes, as mentioned, would either be lurking in the background of shots, and Vidal would be shot in close-ups or low-angle shots looking up at him, whereas in this scene, the cinematography reverses and we see Mercedes being shot in this high-angle shot.
You imbecile! You bloated idiot! You stupid fathead! You...
making her look incredibly brave and powerful, and we see Vidal literally brought to his knees. You know, Mercedes is bringing the patriarchy to its knees, and he is being now shot in this high-angle shot, making him look weak and vulnerable. So is Pan's Labyrinth a film which just says men are bad and women are good? You know, is it a misandrist film? I don't think so. It's a very complex film, like all of the films, and if you're looking to get, you know, those band 5 responses in the exam, you always want to point out the subtleties, nuances, the complex areas areas of the film. And I think Pan's Labyrinth is certainly a feminist film. It has strong, empowered representations of women, but that doesn't mean it's a misandrist film at all. It doesn't hate men. It hates Vidal, it hates that type of man, and he is obviously the antagonist of the film, but there are positive representations of men in the film. One example of that would be the rebels themselves. So they're almost an exclusively male organisation with the exception of Mercedes, and we see a strong sense of brotherhood, compassion. They care about each other, even if the ill health of a rebel might cause greater harm to the group. Like Ophelia, they put the interests of others above their own selfish needs. But probably the most positive representation of a male character would come through Dr. Ferrero. He is an extremely compassionate character. Obviously, he's a doctor, so he's there to administer health and aid to others. He will exhibit qualities that we might traditionally associate with women. So he's very nurturing. One scene where he has to saw off the leg of one of the rebels, you can see that it pains him. He shows a great deal of empathy and compassion. And when the rebel asks him to stop for a moment, he does that. He listens to the person, and then once the rebel then says, yes, it's fine, go ahead, only then does he do it. He's also an incredibly selfless character. So when he sees the torture that's happened to the stuttering rebel, he euthanizes the character, even knowing that it will result in negative consequences for him, and it does. Obviously, Vidal ends up killing him. And he's a disobedient character, and disobedience is something that is associated with women in the film, and he is the one character that most openly voices that when he stands up to Vidal and his stance on obedience.
¿Por qué lo hizo?
Era lo único que podía hacer.
No, hubiera podido obedecerme.
Hubiera podido, pero no lo hice.
Pues hubiera sido mejor para usted. Eso lo sabe. No lo entiendo. ¿Por qué no me obedeció?
Es que obedecer por obedecer, así, sin pensarlo, eso solo lo hacen gentes como usted, capitán.
So overall, I think the Pan's Labyrinth is offering us a range of representations of gender. It has a very clear message, one that I think Judith Butler would agree with. We shouldn't just conform to gender roles. Quite often, those traditional qualities, those stereotypical qualities, actually do a lot more harm than they do good. Despite all of that though, there are actually some positive representations of traditional gender qualities. In particular, I think it's quite interesting that at the end of the film, when Ophelia goes to the magical fantasy kingdom land, the one that she's wanted to go to throughout the whole film, and which is seen as being a really happy ending for her, the person in charge is a king, is a patriarch. So it is a film which perhaps suggests that some male leaders, some male authority figures are positive. And curiously, at the end of the film, it isn't Mercedes or Ophelia or another female character that gets to topple the patriarchy through the character of Vidal and kill Vidal. It is in fact another male character that shoots him. It's Mercedes' brother. So is the film perhaps suggesting that after all you do need a man to restore balance and order, and a woman can't do it or won't do it? So I mentioned earlier that there was a bit of a binary opposition in the way that we might consider gender, and I also think that's perhaps true of the way the film represents power. So the ones in power in this film are the fascists, and the ones who are not in power in the film are the rebels. Or to put it another way, we have rich characters in the fascists and we have poor characters in the rebels. So in this film, the fascists, perhaps unsurprisingly, are being represented in a very negative light, and their kind of figurehead, if you like, is Vidal, who could be a cipher or a substitute for Franco himself. So all of the qualities that we would associate with Vidal, like cruelness, sadism, selfishness, greed, these are things that by extension we can attribute to fascists and the rich in general. And if you do any research into Guillermo del Toro, this is a common theme across his work. You can see it in The Shape of Water as well. He is quite distrustful of authority and the heads of organisations and structures in general, including, you know, things like perhaps governments and the Catholic Church and so on. He's somebody who openly questions those authority figures if he believes that they are unjust. And one of the clearest examples of this would be the banquet scene. So the hypocrisy and the greed and the selfishness of the fascists and those in power comes through very, very clearly. So in this scene, we have this incredible banquet that's being laid out with every possible food that you could want. And whilst these rich, powerful people are sitting around the table and eating whatever they want, they are discussing ration cards. They are discussing the amount of food that the poor, the ordinary civilians, if you like, are allowed to eat. One particularly chilling bit of dialogue comes from one of the priests.
Solo una. Captain, no sé si le será suficiente.
Si la gente es cuidadosa, sí. A esa gente Dios ya les ha salvado el alma. Lo que al cuerpo le suceda, bien.
So, and often films would represent religion and the church as being something that might be a positive thing, but it's very, very clear that in Pan's Labyrinth, the church, just like the fascists, are guilty of being entirely hypocritical, selfish and greedy.
If it brings me to my knees, it's a bad religion. This unrequited love, to me it's nothing but a one-man cult. In cyanide and my styrofoam cup, I could never make 'em love me, never make 'em love me.
And from this scene, it's very clear that the fascist system is being represented as beneficial only to those in power. And if you are not in power, if you're not part of the fascist organisation, then you will suffer. We see this later on in the film where the citizens of Spain are having to queue up for bread, and they are being told how lucky and how fortunate they are to get a small piece of bread. And there is a clear class distinction between the fascists and the rebels. Vidal's costume in particular looks to be very expensive. There is decoration on it. It's very clean. It's very crisp. The colour of it is this cold blue, which is a colour that we would associate with the fascists in general and with the patriarchy. And there is a sense that there is something unnatural or unfeeling or lacking in compassion in these characters. Whereas if you compare it to the costume of the rebels and Mercedes and Dr. Ferrero, and they tend to wear much more earthier tones, colours that we might associate with nature and therefore associate with things that are natural, good, and right. Del Toro encourages us throughout the film to side with the rebels and see them as the good guys. As mentioned, we see them wearing those earth-toned costumes which we would associate with nature, but also the fact that they seem to live in the woods, which again roots them down in the natural world and the world of right and good. And also the colour orange, this warm glow which we see in the fantasy sequences with Ophelia, and also at the end of the film, we also associate that with the rebels because they're the ones who start fires. We see this couple of points in the film, and they always have that kind of orange glow behind them in the frame, which suggests again that there is something warm and inviting about the rebels, the poor people of Spain. Compare this to the fascists, the rich people. They're always associated with this cold, dark blue, desaturated, lifeless tone. When we see the fascists, we have, this downpouring rain, which might suggest tears crying over the unjustness of the system, or just, a pathetic fallacy, the weather reflecting the downbeat mood that the fascists bring about. And the binary oppositions between them is very, very clear at the end scene where the rebels finally confront Vidal. Behind them, we have that warm orange glow that we've mentioned. And then when we cut to shots of Vidal, that reverse shot, we see that he has that cold blue desaturated tone, and obviously he dies at the end of the film, which is this kind of wish fulfillment of the end of fascism, the end of patriarchy as symbolised in the character of Vidal. And at no point are we ever supposed to side with the fascists to see them as being the good guys. They're only ever shown as being cruel, sadistic and selfish. A clear example of that would be the scenes where Vidal tortures the stammering rebel. Likewise, the farmer scene where he kills those two at the start of the film. In terms of narrative, there is no need for that scene to be in the film. If you were to take that out, the rest of the film would make perfect sense. But it is really important for constructing the representations of fascists as being cruel, sadistic, and unjust. It's very clear that the rebels are the innocents in this part of the film and that the fascists are the villains. And perhaps the most chilling aspect of that scene is, firstly, Vidal's completely emotionless face as he is taking these people's lives. But also, immediately after he has just killed these two men, he finds the rabbit and he realises that they were innocent, that they aren't rebels, they were innocently hunting rabbits. Rather than displaying remorse or upset or grief at what he's just done, wrongly taking the lives of two innocent men, Vidal instead just shows an annoyance at having been disturbed by his men. Okay, so that's the end of my video on Pan's Labyrinth representation. I hope that it was helpful. Thank you very much.
Brothers, sisters, we don't need no backscrew pay. Brothers, sisters, we don't need no backscrew pay. Brothers, sisters, we don't need no backscrew